Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? At the time of recording, it's the 8th of April 2020. We are in lockdown. We are 3 weeks or almost 3 weeks into the lockdown for COVID-19. And I thought this would be a really good opportunity to try and speak to some people, speak to some sociologists. If, like me, you're climbing up the walls a little bit, I was desperate to actually speak to someone and carry on my love and passion for sociology. So I decided to get in contact with a few people. The interviews are done by phone, so unfortunately the quality isn't brilliant, but hopefully you find it quite interesting. My guest for this episode was Dr. Marcia Morgan. And Dr. Morgan is best known for her 2018 publication entitled Black Women Prison Employees, the Intersectionality of Gender and Race. I found this a really interesting and fascinating piece of research. If you're studying anything to do with crime and deviance or ethnicity or even identity, gender, this covers so many different areas of sociology. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Marcia Morgan. I'm married, I have a son, I have a daughter who was a gift from my husband. I'm also a Christian. I do a lot of voluntary work. I enjoy reading contemporary multicultural romance novels and cross-country running, taking part in 3 marathons. I also work for Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service as a program transition manager, and I also lecture 1 day a week as a senior lecturer at the University of East London, leading on their psychosocial work reflection module. I'm a level 7 qualified executive coach and mentor, and I recently started coaching and mentoring clients online. I'm a published author. My book, entitled Black Women Prison Employees, the Intersectionality of Gender and Race, was published by Edwin Mellon Press in 2018. And I've also got several academic articles and other publications.
Brilliant, thanks. And we're going to come back to your published book in 2018. That's going to be the main focus of what I'd like to chat to you about. How did you actually get into the subject of sociology yourself? Did you study it at school or college, degree?
Well, I studied sociology as an A-level, but I guess I've always been interested in people's experiences, because I can remember at primary school asking the question to my teacher when we were being taught about Black history. I asked the question, why did my history start at slavery? I'm from Manchester originally, grew up in Moss Side. So I was always conscious about the representation of Black males as gang members when I was seeing other Black males doing other things. So my first sociology project or piece of research that I did looked at how young African Caribbean men were using sound systems as an alternative to getting involved in gang culture, and how they were using that as a means of an income, as their own sort of initiative, and being creative and generating incomes through that. Oh. So I've always been interested in sociology. I guess it just wasn't formalised until I started doing my own research, and then I guess it became more interested in how people, or specifically, I've always had a particular interest in how Black people navigate their advantage positions within society. Yeah,
so I guess you were doing sociology before you knew it, really. Could I ask you a bit about growing up in Moss Side? I know a little bit about the area, mainly from Man City. Used to be playing that area. I know it was quite a deprived area. What was the makeup of the city in terms of ethnic diversity at the time?
Well, it was predominantly African Caribbean people in Moss Side. What you found was a lot of those individuals were Windrush generation who then had their own children who then settled. So the particular area that I lived in was predominantly African Caribbean families that lived there, very working class. Obviously, the gang culture kind of made it quite notorious. I happened to live in one of the areas that had one of the gangs, so I experienced that kind of living of people having a particular perception of the area, which was very different to actually living there. There was that sense of community there. A lot of us went to the local primary schools and secondary schools, so you knew families, and you could have families living on the same street for many, many years.
That's really interesting. You say the view from the outside. You know, as a white male from the south of England, I would not have gone through Moss Side as a youngster. I would have just been warned against it. That's really interesting that you know, the perception on the outside compared to you living in that area.
Yeah, it was very different. I mean, whenever I have relatives that live in London, and whenever I would visit London, it would be, how can you live in Moss Side? Are you not hearing gunshots all the time? Is it not a dangerous place? But yet we used to play in the park as normal. We would go to parties as normal. We'd walk along the street as normal. You would see grandmas with their shopping trolleys. So it felt safe, but people had a perception that it wasn't safe, and that, I guess, was just the media. Yeah,
absolutely. And then so you went on to study sociology at A-level, and then was there a particular theory or a sociologist that really grabbed you, inspired you, made you passionate about the subject?
Well, no, in all honesty, there wasn't at that time. I was I wouldn't say a rebellious academic, but I was interested in how people think, and I was interested in community ways of living and what happened. So I studied sociology and psychology A-level. And then I was very much around, I wanted to study the things that I wanted to study. So when I went on to do my undergraduate degree, I complementary medicine and health sciences. Again, that was because I wanted to look at an alternative way of... My grandmother at the time was ill, and I wanted to look at alternative remedies that might help her. So I went and decided to study that. But yeah, I still was looking at... my dissertation looked at African Caribbean men's experience of mental health, because at the time I was really noticing that either African Caribbean men were going to prisons or doing their alternative things, or they were being labelled as schizophrenics. And I went and volunteered at an organisation called African Caribbean Mental Health Services, and there were a lot of African Caribbean men who were diagnosed as schizophrenic, so I wanted to understand their experiences of the system. So there wasn't a particular sociologist I would say had grabbed me. I mean, you sort of have the usual ones. I think what I definitely picked up, though, when I was studying my A-levels and went on to do my undergraduate, was that all the academics were white men, technically. Yeah. And I couldn't relate to them. So, and I felt, although some of their theories were actually relevant, I think it was just that concern that why do they not look like me? And that's when I started to look at some African-American feminists, and that's how I got introduced to black feminism. I was thinking there must be people who are academics that are of my reflection, that are saying things.
I just want to, sorry, I'm probably going off on a slight tangent here, but I'm interested you say black feminism. I've been reading a lot recently about the correct terminology, black feminism, intersectional feminism, difference feminism. What do you use? I'm really interested to know how you define it.
Well, I'm very much from the school of thought of intersectionality, which is a branch of black feminism. I fully grasp and have acknowledged the fact that black feminism stems from feminism, and the fact that in the feminist movement, black women's position as intersectional subjects in which gender and race affects our perception, affects our experience, affects our reality, affects the way that people actually interact with us, is a really important part of our lived experience. And for me, I guess it's a label.
Yeah.
People use it in different ways, but I would say that I'm from the position of an intersectionality school of thought, where I feel that gender and race can't be looked at separately if you're looking to grasp the experience of a black female, because irrespective of all your other identities, race is a significant part of someone's identity. Yeah. And you can't change your race. You can change other aspects of your identity, but you cannot change your ethnicity.
And that sort of brings us quite neatly into your research, because I know that area is very heavily interlinked about ethnicity and gender. Do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction into your study that was published in 2018?
Yeah, so my thesis itself was published 2016. My book was published in 2018. My thesis examined the social experience of black women working in Her Majesty's Prisons and Probation Service. What I did was I applied an intersectionality framework and organisational psychodynamics theory to examine what it meant to be black, woman and an employee within a particular location of prisons. And what I found was that as gendered and racialised individuals, black women were actually insiders while they were also outsiders, and that's an Audre Lorde sort of concept of insider within. So although they were employees, they were still very much outside of being the axiomatic prison employee, which was a white male ex-military at that time. What I also looked at was the fact that it wasn't just about being gendered and racialized, it was also the organisation itself and the dynamics within that organisation and the structures within the organisation located black women on the margins, because they were now disrupting the status quo of what the organisation represented. So what my study did was it looked at the different experiences in different situations, and I looked at sort of the journey of becoming a prison officer, looked at how the culture of the organisation, which is premised on mistrust, suspicion and violence, and how black women then negotiated that organisation from that perspective. But then I also looked at how the organisation uses mistrust, suspicion and violence as a natural social defence system. So that's where I introduced the concepts of Melanie Klein's object relations and David Armstrong's organisation The Mind, to actually look at how the organisation itself has a particular practice. So you have, for example, the mission statement that when I was doing my research, it was around protect the public, punish those convicted of the court and rehabilitate them. But yet, the work that people are going in to do, you have operational staff who are your officers that wear the uniform, and you would have non-operational staff like your teachers, nurses, etc. And they were doing very different roles. And sometimes, because of the roles that they were doing, it would create tension between those groups. And then out of that tension, you would actually have the reality of what was happening. So you may have, for example, a member of staff who's a teacher who's not been able to teach prisoners because there's been a security issue and prisoners are not going down to education, for example. And then that again would cause tension. But underlying all of those different interactions was the issues around gender and race. What always stood out was that whether you were a black female or you were of another ethnic group or of a particular gender, those interactions were always underlaid by whatever else going on. I then looked at how, for example, control and restraint, which is a practice that's used in prisons, could be unconsciously used by the organisation as a means to introduce black women into the organisation of institutional racism, which isn't a policy or a process, but studies have shown and the organisation has been seen to be institutionally racist. But then how are those unconscious elements of the organisation brought out? So I looked at how black women were experiencing institutional racism and looked at how they may have been inducted into that type of culture. I also looked at how the triangular relationships that occur between black women and their managers, and I looked at how the hierarchical system of prisons also affects black women's experience of the organisation. And what I found was that in triangular relationships, what sometimes played out is the Oedipus complex, of where you will have three individuals and one is always feeling the outsider and looking in. And what I found in my research was black women all tended to be the person that was looking into the triangular relationship and was always feeling excluded and isolated. I also looked at, applied Beyond's theory of group relationships to look at how groups are formed and how the fact that black women as gendered racialized subjects are sometimes not fully part of that group, and then how the group sometimes self-destructs because of that anxiety and fear of having someone who is gender and racially different to the majority of the group. And then I introduced the concept of strong black woman, which is a psychosocial defense mechanism which is utilized by black women. And when I use the term black women in this context of my research, I'm using it from a political aspect, which encompasses African Caribbean women and Asian women also. And what I found was that the strong black woman psychosocial concept transcends across ethnic groups. So although the concept strong black woman originated from black history, it actually comes from a position of overcoming racism and racial disadvantage, and that's why it's able to transcend across different ethnic groups. And then finally, with any sort of psychosocial research, it's important to locate the researcher in that study. And as a black female myself, it was important for me to understand my position as a practitioner and as a researcher, and also as a gendered racialized subject as well. So I looked at my experience of being a black woman practitioner researcher, undertaking a piece of research that's looking at the psychosocial experience of black women in the organisation while working for the organisation, and the impact that had on me during that journey. So that's really a nutshell of my whole research.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm quite interested about what you said about your role. So what was your role within the prison when you were working there?
So at the time of doing my research, I was doing various roles. So I worked at a prison establishment as one of their senior managers. I mean, in my first chapter of the book, it actually talks about my experience as a practitioner researcher, and I share in there my first day of. So maybe what I should explain to you is what propelled me to do the research in the first place was because at the time I was working at an establishment. I wanted to take part in a fast track scheme that would allow middle grade staff to work through the hierarchy in becoming senior managers and at one day becoming a governing governor. I was turned down for that fast track, but there was no explanation given as to why. When I then looked into whether any other black person had ever taken part in this research, in this fast track, it turned out at that time that no one who was from an ethnic minority group had taken part in it. So then I started to ask questions, well, why is that? Also, why I decided to do my PhD was when I was doing my master's, I looked at the implementation of race relations in prisons, because at that time, it was around the time when you had the Mubarak inquiry, where I'm not sure if you're aware of the Mubarak inquiry, but what had happened was a young offender who was Asian was murdered by his white racist cellmate, and out of that there was a Mubarak inquiry that looked to the processes and practices of prisons, and a number of things had came out, and there was an action plan that was driven by the Commissioner for Race Equality at the time. And at that time, a number of diversity managers and race relation officers were introduced, and prisons were actively trying to change the culture of prisons. But what I found when I was doing my piece of research on the implementation of race relations was that a lot of the research about prison staff or prison occupation was written from the perspective of white male prison officers. Yeah. There was no studies that were looking at black women specifically. Where there was any conversations about race, it was always dominated by black male prison officers. And likewise, any studies that was looking at gender issues or sexism, it was always from the perspective of white females. So again, the black woman's position was always overshadowed by other groups. And I just felt like I needed to change that. because black women work in the prison service as well, and we were just invisible in prison occupation literature. We was invisible in research. We were invisible in the media, in adverts that were promoting prisons at that time. So it was important for me to understand why that was happening. And one of my concerns was that people tend to try to dilute it by saying, well, it's just racial discrimination, but it's more than that. It's about looking at the organizational dynamics itself and why organizations perpetuate the same practices, even though it sets out to say it's not, and it's trying to implement race relations. But yeah, those race relation initiatives weren't making the impact in regards to changing the culture. And that's where the unconscious element of organizations and the psychosocial part of it comes into play.
Yeah, I think I was doing a little bit of reading, and you mentioned at some point it was kind of assumed whenever you turned up in the early stages that you must have been a visitor rather than an employee. Is that right?
Yeah, so I always ask the question when I was doing my studies, why is this the case? Why is that there's and that's where I came with this axiomatic employee of white male is what works in prisons, and people assume that. So even now, when I'll say to someone, I work for the prison service, they're always shocked by, you're a black female and you work for the prison service. But yeah, and then even in the black community, if I say I work for the prison service, it's still very much, why would you work in such an organisation? But yeah, if you observe the way which people view black women in the prisons, they always assume you would be either a domestic visitor or a prisoner. It never comes to mind that you might actually be an employee or even a manager in that particular organisation.
Yeah. So how did you actually, what was your methodology, if you like? How did you actually collect your data and information? And was it kind of a covert approach? Did anyone know that you were conducting research at the same time as working as an employee?
Oh yeah, I was very open and transparent, because one of the things that I think is very important when you're trying to do research, that you're trying to get people's experience, is that you need to be open and honest. So I did a lot of publicity in a sense. I always think of it as, during the civil rights movement, and even before then, when you had sort of the Underground Railroad, where you're promoting your work. So at events, I would have flyers that would say, who I am. I'm looking to find out about the experiences of black women. I was always conscious that when I attended events before I started doing my research, I don't know if you ever come across the term like the black nod. So the fact that black women or black people in general made up less than 5% of the prison staff population, whenever you went to events, if you saw another black person, you would automatically say hello, because it's nice to just see someone of your reflection. Yeah. And when you start having conversation, you generally get into the conversation of talking shock or what happened, and you always talk about something negative. So what I found was there wasn't people that was afraid to talk about their experiences, but talking about it and not actually creating that into actually theory and understanding it are two different things, and that's what I wanted to do. So I publicised my research. I went through the ethical process with my university. The organisation itself, their response to my proposal was very much no. They wanted me to do a comparative study between black women and white women, although I explained to them the use of, you can't compare one ethnic group with another if you're looking into intersectionality, because I can't compare black women to white women because their experiences are very different. Specifically, if you look at the fact that white women share racial superiority with white men, so straight away they're in a different position to black women who share neither race nor gender. Yeah. The organisation found it difficult to accept that. And also, if you bear in mind, I started my research back in 2008, 2009, so intersectionality was not known really then. It's only in the last probably 5 years that it's really taken up momentum and people started to talk about intersectionality more. So at that time, the organisation was not even understanding the term intersectionality. So they were not as supportive as I would have liked, although they did financially part fund my PhD. So there were some individuals that were actually thinking, actually, this might be something beneficial to the organisation, because we need to understand the experiences of all groups, not just between black and white, because between black and white then doesn't take into account the gender differences that occur. And what we found is that black men's experience will be different to black women's experience. They may share the experience of racism and racial discrimination, but then they don't share the same experience of being a minority because of your gender. So it was important for me to go through the process and be very transparent in what I aim to do. The whole purpose of my research was to make black women visible within the prison organisational context. So when I was doing my research, I was very open with the participants. The participants self-referred themselves, because that was another thing. About 5 years before my own research, the prison service had completed a race relations thematic review that looked at the experiences of black staff in comparison to white staff, and also black prisoners in comparison to white prisoners. And having spoken to individuals that were involved in that, I was concerned that I wanted the authenticity of what my participants were saying. I wanted them to be open to share. With that particular study that I just mentioned, went through governors, which then reduces the issues around anonymity and confidentiality, whereas I wanted my participants to feel free and open to discuss whatever they felt was relevant during their journey. So it was fully anonymous. The organisation, all the prisons organisations were all given pseudonyms, so you would not be able to identify any of the participants in my research.
Yeah, and was it mainly kind of unstructured interviews, or was there any observations? How did you collect most of your data?
There was no observations, but I because I worked for the organisation, I applied the concept of the ethnographic eye.
Yeah.
So when participants were sharing particular experiences, because by that time I had worked in 4 different prisons, which were male prisons, young offenders. So I'd worked in various different prisons in different roles. So when they talked about things, I could understand it and relate to it and visualise it, and that's where the ethnographic eye comes into, by the fact that I've worked in that organisation, I've experienced it for myself. I understand what they mean. For example, the carceral space of always being supervised and watched, because we know in prisons there are always cameras, there's always people around, so you are always being observed. So I knew how that may feel, or how what it looks like, because I've experienced it myself. So there was no participant observations. It was I started out with 5 questions, which were around, tell me about your journey as being an employee from the beginning up until now. So it was quite open. Talk to me about how your skills, how you apply your skills, or what you feel you bring to the organisation. So again, there were very open questions in which participants then spoke about whatever they felt to talk about.
I might come back on one bit, because you mentioned the importance of intersectionality before people even kind of use the word. There was a line that I noticed, gender is race and race is gendered, which really intrigued me. I wondered if you could talk that one through a little bit more.
So in relation to that is, it comes from a position where a lot of research that looks at race relations doesn't take into account the issues of gender. So when I was talking about the fact that black women and black men both experience racial discrimination in different ways, because black women experience racial discrimination from also the perspective of being gendered as being women. So, for example, you will see a black woman within a prison context. If a black woman is assertive, she will be described as being aggressive, and then her colleagues will respond to her in a particular manner, which will be very different to how they will respond to a black male. If a black male displays that same type of behaviour, he won't be classed as aggressive, he will just be classed as doing his job. Yeah. So the fact that you've got the racial stereotype, but sometimes those racial stereotypes are actually underpinned by gender differences, and that's why I use the term that race is gender and gender is race, because you can't, as a black woman, I can't determine whether someone has referred to me as being aggressive because I'm black or because I'm woman. I can't pick. And like when I've been involved in various forums where I can recall being invited to a forum that was looking at gender issues, and then being invited to a similar forum that was looking at race issues, and I would say, well, am I black today?
Yeah,
am I a woman tomorrow?
Yeah.
You know, which one can I can't be one without the other.
Absolutely. If you're happy to, would you be able to give an example of a situation or something that you think really, really demonstrated the stereotyping in relation to ethnicity and gender? Is there a particular event or scenario or something that happened whilst you were working there?
I think it's just the way in which, and a lot of black women will share this in regardless of what sector they may work in, the fact that their voice is always tried to be stunted.
Yeah.
So you may go into a meeting and you'll be sharing your views and you're always spoken over. And then when you then assert yourself, you're being challenged as being aggressive.
I mean, I don't know if you'd be able to answer this one. Is there one that overrides the other? Do you think that you are more judged on your gender or your ethnicity? I know that sort of goes against what intersectionality is, but do you think there is one characteristic that dominates?
I think they're both entwined. I think what you will find, for example, I can recall working in one particular establishment where my governor had said to me that I was managing my department, and the governor had said to me, "You're very aggressive, and I think you'll be dangerous because you're just very direct." Yeah. And then I explained to him, "But I have colleagues who display the same type of behaviour, and would you say that to them?" And he said, "Well, no, they're men." So I said, "Well, there's a problem there." So I guess in that context, he's seeing the gender differences. But yet, he said, my other female managers, they're a bit more human. And I was like, well, does that mean, are you saying that they're human because they become emotional and I don't? And he was like, well, you're not as, you're very direct. And he just kept using the word direct. Yeah. And so it was a problem for me, but not a problem for my white male counterparts and my also black male counterparts as well, because there was a black male that was working there at the same time. That's really interesting.
Where's that leading you to now? Have you followed on the research, or are you working on something else?
So I'm currently, I've submitted a proposal which was included in the third International Conference on Gender Relations, and I was looking at I submitted a proposal that would be looking at the complexities of intersectionality amongst women leaders. Yeah. And that's just because now the civil service has got a drive on to increase their senior civil servants from black groups by, I think, 6-7%, and there's a big drive to increase the number of civil servants from other ethnic groups. But I wanted to look at that in relation to intersectionality and looking at how that will affect women, specifically black women, because when I've looked at the statistics, I can see that at the moment, senior civil servants, if we look at gender, it's more or less 50% male, 50% female. But then when you break down the female section, the proportion of black women is very small. Yeah. It's very, very small in comparison to the 50% women. So although the organisation will say, yeah, we are genderly diverse, when we then break that down a bit further, you will see that black women are not in that group of 50% white women. So I'm at the moment, my proposal is to look at black women within specifically the Ministry of Justice at the moment to see how their experience of accessing the frameworks and stuff that are in place that which is supposed to propel them into senior management roles, see how effective they actually are. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I mean, one last question before we round up in relation to that. Have you seen progress in the time that you've been working and studying? Have you seen developments, improvements in relation to ethnicity and gender?
Yes, I mean, in all fairness to the organisation that I work for, we are seeing a slight increase. I mean, the civil servant as a whole, if I'm not mistaken, their last stats showed that they had, I think, 7% of their FTS levels were from non-white groups. I haven't seen the statistics in relation to gender, because that's something that I'm trying to push for, that we need to do an intersectional analysis of the actual data, where we're actually breaking it down, not just white and ethnic groups, but actually breaking down the actual ethnic groups themselves and breaking them down by gender. I think my biggest, I guess I would say, achievement in relation to the organisation is having completed the research, having introduced the concept of intersectionality to organisation, having received the endorsement from Sir Richard Heaton, who's our permanent secretary. I'm now starting to see more senior managers and more initiatives are looking at intersectionality, looking at the experiences of black women and different hierarchical groups as well, looking at, there's a lot of different initiatives that are being introduced around diverse panels when it comes to interviews and promotion. So I am seeing proactive change. I think my question is, and what I want to see now is, how's that being grounded? Because from my experience of going through the Mubarak inquiry and the implementation of race relations in prisons, you have a lot of momentum, you have a lot of initiatives, but they are not grounded. And if you remember at the very beginning of this interview, I talked about the 3 layers of the organisation, the what we say we're doing, what we're doing, and then the reality of it. And if they're not all joined up together, then sadly what we might find in 10 years' time, there'll be more initiatives trying to do the same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Marcia. That's really, really fascinating. I'm sure listeners have really enjoyed what you've got to say. Where can we find out more about your work? Where can we read about your book? Have you got a blog or anything like that you'd like to plug at all?
Yeah, so I've got a website which is www.black-women-amazons.com. There I have a blog which I post regularly that gives tips and encouragement to women and men as well, black women specifically, on how to be academics and be professionals in the workplace. So I share my experience, I share some useful tips. All my publications are there also, so if anyone's interested in my book or any of my articles, all the links are there and how you can purchase them. That's probably my main post. I'm also on Instagram, which again is Marcia Morgan, Black Women Amazons. I'm on Twitter also, Marcia T455, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, Marcia Morgan.
That's brilliant. I really, really appreciate you giving up your time today, Marcia. So thank you very much for the interview, and best wishes for your future studies as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.